Hi, this is Chuck Wolf. You're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. And this is on WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut, community radio. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for your support. And in today's show, I'm very pleased to have two guest speakers, Cary Cherniss and Cornelia Roche, who have written a new book called Leading with Feeling. And I've just finished reading it. I think there's a ton of information that will be very helpful to anyone who is in a position to influence others, to lead others at every level. And I think you'll find that the actual content will be very practical, a very easy guide to help you to understand how there are ways that you can be leading with feeling, leading in a more emotionally intelligent way. And I'm going to introduce the two authors. Cary has received his PhD in psychology from Yale University. He taught at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the University of Illinois in Chicago, the Chicago Medical School, and the Illinois Institute of Technology. In 1983, he came to Rutgers, where he helped create the doctoral program in organizational psychology at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. He currently is Professor of Applied Psychology, Emeritus at Rutgers. He specializes in emotional intelligence, leadership development, and planned organizational change. He's published over 60 scholarly articles and book chapters on these topics, as well as 8 books. His most recent one, and the one we'll be talking about, is Leading with Feeling, 9 Strategies of Emotionally Intelligent Leadership. Dr. Cherniss has consulted with many organizations in both the public and private sectors, including American Express, Johnson & Johnson, the U.S. Coast Guard, AT&T, and PSEG Power. He currently is director and co-chair of the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations. He is a member of both the Academy of Management and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And Cornelia Roche has performed management coaching in a variety of corporate settings and has consulted to schools, nonprofit entities, and small business, drawing upon research and her previous management experience in a Fortune 500 company. Her work involves helping professionals better understand and navigate the individual and organizational forces that impact on their work. In addition to consulting, Cornelia has served as a staff member of the Wharton School's Executive Development Program, and she is affiliated with the Emotional Intelligence Consortium since its inception. She has a doctorate from Rutgers University in organizational psychology. She currently resides in northern New Jersey with her husband and son. Okay. Also, I'd like to just say that I know Cary and Cornelia, I guess we've met once or twice, from the consortium myself, because I'm a member of that, and I've actually been really privileged to be a part of this organization that Cary co-founded with Dan Goleman many years ago. And it is one of the most interesting places to spend time with other people who are leading thinkers in this field of emotional intelligence. And one of the things that I've come to learn about you, Cary, is that you are someone that has a way of bridging all the different models in the field in a very collaborative, nonpartisan way, if you will. Yeah, when I first entered the field, so over 20-some years ago, and began working with Peter Salve, Jack Mayer, and David Caruso, I was struck by the different models, and really struggled with the idea of when people talked about how emotional intelligence was having this amazing impact in the world. I often wondered, well, what emotional intelligence were they talking about? And you had such a nice way of bridging all of this and bringing people together. And the consortium really is a place where people come with a variety of ideas and models in their minds, and everybody is extremely respectful. The dialogue is wonderful and really exciting and inspiring and innovative. Lots of really useful ideas. And I think the book that you and Cornelia together have written is, what does it really mean to lead with emotional intelligence? And how do you do it? I mean, how do you actually do it? And I think you've both captured some wonderful strategies that are going to be really useful to everybody. So Cary, one of the things I thought I'd start with is just asking, how did you come to write this book? But why now, and why this kind of book about strategies? And how did you and Cornelia partner up to write it?
Well, thank you very much for all those kind words. I really appreciate it. In part because that's exactly what we've tried to do with the consortium. And I might add for your listeners that Chuck has really played an instrumental role in doing that. He comes to the meetings regularly and really helps to represent models and ways of viewing things that other people aren't familiar with. So thanks for that, Chuck.
Thanks, Cary.
The way in which the book came about is that, as you know, and as some of your listeners undoubtedly know, the concept of emotional intelligence has been around for a while now. Dan Goleman wrote his best-selling book on it back in 1995. So we're now talking about 25 years of discussion and theorizing and research and the like, and practice, a lot of practice as well. And I realized a few years ago that there now is a lot of research on what emotional intelligence is, how to measure emotional intelligence, and perhaps most important, the very strong link between emotional intelligence and important outcomes, well-being, motivation, job satisfaction, engagement, performance as well. So we now have a lot of literature showing that there is a strong relationship. What we don't have much research on is how do leaders actually use their emotional intelligence to deal with critical challenges and opportunities. And that lack has actually been noted by some of the leading thinkers in the field. Peter Salovey, several years ago, mentioned that was an area of research that people should start looking at next. How do people, all kinds of people, use emotional intelligence? Stefan Cote, another very prominent researcher, said the same thing. So I thought that it would really be interesting to try to study that. And so that was basically the question that we started with. How do leaders, and particularly outstanding leaders, use their emotional intelligence? And we began doing this, we became more and more excited because we realized that while there are more and more really good programs to help people to increase their emotional intelligence, a lot of people in leadership positions already have a considerable amount of emotional intelligence. And by learning a few of these strategies, they can really leverage their emotional intelligence and maximize its power in the workplace. And as we were doing the research, what was emerging was exactly that, these strategies that these leaders who were particularly high in emotional intelligence were using to deal with critical situations. So that's really how the book came about.
Well, so one of the things that I noticed at the end of the book, you had written something along the lines that sometimes it takes more time if you're going to engage in being more emotionally intelligent and look at and consider people's feelings, that it actually might take you more time on the front end. And I was struck because years ago in the quality movement, there was a saying that said, we never have time to do it right, but we always have time to fix it when it doesn't go well. And I thought that really held true kind of here as well. I work in this field that started around the late 1990s with the pioneers, Salovey, Mayer, and Crusoe, and so forth. And early on, I began to realize that you never really were allowed to sort of bring your emotions into the workplace. I mean, we always brought them in, but you weren't sort of supposed to. And then Dan's book, I think, kind of opened the floodgates to this idea that, you know what, if we're smarter about emotions, I mean, if you think about when you mentioned engagement a minute ago, and Gallup, every few years or every year, does all these studies about how engagement is so low in so many organizations, relatively speaking. Fully engaged organization of people dedicated, working as hard as they could, obviously are going to be the best situation for every possible company, nonprofit or otherwise. And so when you're looking at it like that, and you realize that engagement's an emotional issue, and the idea of if you're smarter about how you deal with feelings, that it really resonates, and that while you might not want to take the time because you're always in a rush, it seems, to get things done, that when you do take the time, the outcomes are so much better. And that's, I think, what you show in your book. And so one of the things that I did want to ask you about as well, though, it seemed like a lot of the case studies were about leaders at fairly high levels. As a leader at every level, it seems to me it could be useful for anybody first entering as a leader, as well as everybody in middle management, as well as senior management. Did you have a sort of target audience for this? Does it make a difference or what level you are if you're reading this book?
Absolutely. I think that leaders at all level and even people who are not in formal leadership positions, but are in roles where it's important for them to try to influence others, to create a kind of emotional climate which makes people feel good about their work, gets them engaged. So absolutely, leaders at all levels will benefit from this. But you're right, most of the people in our study were either middle or executive level.
Well, let me turn to you, Cornelia, and ask you a little bit about the research, because when you say you're talking to outstanding leaders, I think sort of everybody has their own idea of what it means to be an outstanding leader. And sometimes companies talk about certain aspects of what they look for in their leaders, and then they promote somebody who doesn't fit any of the characteristics that sound so wonderful when they first write about them. But in your case, it seemed like you had a procedure for helping to identify who was really a successful leader. You want to talk a little bit about how you developed that criteria and also kinds of leaders, because it seemed like you covered lots of different organizations. It wasn't just large companies. It seemed like it went from large companies to smaller and some nonprofits. So you want to talk a little bit about who you talked to and why?
Sure. We actually obtained referrals for leaders who exemplified emotional intelligence in their dealings with their workers. So we received referrals and recommendations from people from HR, leadership, consultants, executive coaches, and also referrals from other leaders who thought of leaders in their own experience who they thought really utilized emotional intelligence and put it into action and thought that they may be good people to speak with. So it was a network that we developed of leaders that we interviewed for the book.
So sometimes when I've done workshops, one of the fun exercises and one of the ways of capturing what it means to be emotionally intelligent as a leader is to ask people who, in your experience, are people that you can think about that were emotionally intelligent leaders. And I don't need their names as much as what were their characteristics? What can they tell me about them? So what can you sort of tell me about the people and the characteristics that you found in your group when you decided who you were going to talk to? What showed up in those recommendations? What were some of the criteria that you found that was important for people that were considered by all these different groups to be emotionally intelligent?
Well, not everybody is familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence. So the way we framed it was, what leaders can you think of who were not only outstanding and successful and effective, but particularly good at using and managing their own emotions and the emotions of other people. That was basically it. And that's what we found. I mean, there was an enormous range in terms of personality. You know, there are a lot of theories of leadership that are really based on personality characteristics. For instance, for years, people thought that you had to be extroverted to be an effective leader. And it sort of makes some sense. Turned out not to be true. There's almost no difference between extroversion and introversion in terms of effective leaders. And that applies to almost any kind of personality characteristic. For a while, I mean, this goes way back, but there was a theory back in the, 20s, 30s, that a person's height was predictive of how effective they would be as a leader.
I think that still works in terms of promotions, but
yeah, that's true. One of the things that we learned early on from Richard Boyatzis, one of our colleagues in the consortium, was there's a big difference between success and effectiveness. So yeah, if you're just looking at success in terms of promotion, maybe, height or extroversion do have an effect. But of course, in the business world, nonprofits, education, what we're really interested in is effectiveness. And the leaders who are effective and also manage themselves and other people really well are the kinds of leaders that we were looking for. And so there were introverts, there were extroverts, just all kinds of short people, tall people, all kinds.
different female, male, and as you said earlier, Chuck, we had a lot of different representation from different industries. So everywhere from schools, nonprofits, family business, corporations, social service agencies. So it really ran the gamut, which is really unusual in books that I read. I love that about the research, was that it really touched a lot of different areas of work.
How did you decide, Cornelia, on what kinds of companies or groups of or types of people or organizations you were going to visit with?
We were open to all the different industries because the study was really on leadership, and we really and emotional intelligence. So we really wanted that being the focus rather than the particular industry. So for us, we had a wide net in terms of where to look.
And the kinds of questions that you were asking people that ended up being the data that you collected, what kinds of questions were you asking that ended up in these strategies? Did you know the strategies going in, or is that something that emerged from the data?
No, that emerged. That's the interesting part, is how it emerged. We conducted interviews with each of these 25 leaders, and it lasted between an hour to 90 minutes. It was based on what's called the behavioral event interview. And so it's really about somebody speaking about a particular event that happened to them. And as a researcher, our role is to probe and to get more details and information and sort of paint the picture of what that event actually looked and felt like. So I would basically start off the interview with a question, tell me about 2 incidents that happened to you recently where you had to either manage your emotions or that you had to deal with your emotions on some level. And so that would start off the conversation after sort of getting, we'd have the introductory sort of thing that would happen with, what's your role in the company. So I could have a little bit of a background in terms of where they worked. But that initial question would then start a conversation. And from that conversation, I would ask some probing questions and also some open-ended questions to get people to really fill out the details of what exactly happened. So that was pretty much the premise of the interview.
Then you went through the data, and these emerged as strategies. These 9 different strategies. It's interesting. I was looking. I made a list of the strategies. At least. One was I guess climate was one. Either you're measuring the emotional climate, and then express feelings to motivate others and consider your behavioral impact on others, and step in others' shoes, the empathic part, the emotional dynamics, reframe how you think, create optimal interpersonal boundaries. Those last 2, I think, were particularly interesting to me because, Cary, I do this emotion roadmap as a technology or as a template, and I could see almost in every case study, because I frame things that way, that it's really asking, if people aren't feeling the way you want them to feel, how do you want them to feel? And how do you get there? And I could almost make the case that on every strategy you were doing that. But these last 2 are things that I hadn't really thought about very much in terms of the reframing and the boundary question. And then seek help from others, and then help others develop their emotional intelligence skills. And I was thinking about this. What went through my mind, Cary, is that you do this as the director of the Emotional Consortium. I really do. I mean, I thought you weren't the case study, but as I know you, you are the case study, or you do almost all of these things as far as I could tell. So anyway,
Chuck, all I can say to that is, I'm going to be sure that my wife sees this.
Well, there's a fan for you. Okay. Now, I want to make sure we get to the content, which is the part where we actually talking about how do people do some of these things. So I want to jump to the chapters, and ahead of time, I talked with the 2 of you about dividing the chapters up so that we'd be talking first with Cornelia about chapter 3, and then ask you to spend a little bit of time just talking a little bit about, so people have a sort of at least something they can take away that isn't just about how the study got done, but what did the study teach us? And because I really try really hard on this show, the show's the taglines, take the wheel and control how you feel, but it isn't just how you feel, how others feel too. And I think your strategies really help to do that. So Cornelia, would you mind just jumping into chapter 3, talking about what that chapter's about and what some of the learnings and lessons and the cases were from that?
Sure. So chapter 3, it's called What is Your Impact on Others? And while it may seem obvious, like who would think that a leader wouldn't know their impact on others? And I think there are some leaders who are very much aware of their impact on others, but maybe not to the extent that they, their effectiveness. But they have a great influence on the emotional tone that a group takes. For instance, in the book, there was a particular case where James, who was a senior VP of a very large consulting agency, under one of the episodes that he discussed was he had undergone a very stressful time. One of his senior VPs or directors had left very quickly due to illness and almost disappeared. Could not find him. And the agency was going through regulatory issues. So they were kind of in the midst of a lawsuit. And he knew how panicked this particular division was in the organization. So he decided, rather than panic himself, even though he was very stressed and worried, he situated himself there at the office and took on a calming influence on the group, right? So he decided he was going to be a part and get his hands dirty and get through this. So he communicated to his group just by his presence and the way that he expressed himself, that he was going to influence them in a way that would help them adapt and sort of cope with the stressful circumstances brought about by these issues. There's lots of different ways that leaders can influence the group, but that was just one of the stories that we talk about, which is how did James do that under such dire circumstances?
His key role in that was showing up, and his showing up gave the confidence to the team that they were going to be okay somehow. And I think somehow you got to manage your own emotions a lot then, right? This was not just managing theirs as much as it started with, it seems like, the ability to manage his own emotions. And I thought, because, Cary knows that I do a lot with the Mesquite, and that's the ability model of emotional intelligence. And I thought to myself that stress impacting your ability to lead with feeling probably is different for people who are really high on emotion management, who have a real skill set and an ability to take that step, even though they're feeling stressed, and work with it, and somebody else who feels like they got to run from that because they don't feel well with it.
Right. It's definitely a theme where, even though they might want to break down or they're feeling so stressed they feel like walking out, it was a sense that though they would get through it, and that they could not, they were in it together, but they didn't want to seem that they were so stressed out or panicked that would make other people sort of follow suit. So they understood the emotional tone of their leadership at the time.
So this is really somebody very aware of the impact of his behavior on this group, and that's sort of what this chapter is about, and that's a case that represents that. I did want to mention to you, one time on this show, on my radio show, I had Linda Hill. Do you know Linda Hill from Harvard? She's a professor at Harvard University.
Yeah.
Harvard, you tend to think of Harvard professors in the business school focusing on very senior people, but Linda spent a lot of time on that first level of management, how it feels when you first become boss. But one of the things she commented on my radio show is about your impact on others. And she said there's 2 questions she asked people. I thought they were brilliant. One was, how do people feel in your presence? Ask somebody that you trust to tell you how people feel in their presence. And then a second question, even more interesting, is how do they feel about themselves in your presence? I thought it was a great question. I thought, actually, she'd be someone, if we ever think about it, we got room for a speaker, or maybe ever meet again when we get out of this virtual world, she'd be a great person to have on. She's really brilliant and fun to listen to and talk with. But those were 2 questions I thought related to that chapter when I read about this. Any other thoughts about that chapter that you'd like to share, Cornelia?
There was another example, which was one of the leaders had been monitoring a meeting. Her name was Cynthia. And she noticed that a lot of her management staff looked very glum. And she was thinking to herself, why do they feel so glum? I just gave some good financial results. So she actually did an intervention to help the senior management sort of reflect on what she had just reported, and to start and to ask them, you know, how did you do it? And after having done that, the senior management like then sort of, you know, perked up, became much more alive, I guess, engaged in a way that she hadn't seen at the beginning of the meeting. And I always thought, you know, that's a really interesting thing when you're monitoring the emotional climate of a group. You know, you actually can do things right there on the spot that might get the tone of the group, the emotion of the group to change. So I always thought that was an interesting example. And it wasn't a big, you know, it wasn't a really big thing. It was just asking a question or having the senior management reflect on it that got them to hit another tone.
When I read that case, I was struck by the fact that I guess there had been some depressing things happening in the past, and that this was something where they achieved a milestone, but nobody was really celebrating the milestone. And when you wrote about it, and she decided to ask them to step back and reflect on how they hit that milestone, all of a sudden everything changed. And so that's a great example, I think, of helping to manage, you know, influence somebody else's emotions in a very positive way. And you have to know you have to realize that the impact you wanted when you were sharing the good news wasn't the impact you were having. And so she then created a new strategy to try to create the impact she wanted to see. And it seemed like it turned things around. That was a really neat example, I thought. Thank you. So let's move on to chapter 6 with Cary. And Cary, you want to talk about that chapter and some of the cases and some of the examples and why, and what it is that people might take away from that?
I'd be delighted to. So another one of those strategies was to reframe the way in which you think about a situation. That was a strategy that, like some of the other strategies, is really targeted to help leaders to manage their own emotions, particularly in very difficult situations, when they're, you know, feeling really stressed out, when they're feeling anxious, worried, when they're really annoyed, angry, feeling desperate, hopeless. These are negative emotions that are really painful for the people experiencing them, of course. But when a leader begins to feel this way, it can really have a devastating impact on the group and the organization. So it's very important that they use their emotional intelligence to manage these emotions when they experience them. And what we found when we looked at all of these incidents was that a lot of these leaders were using this strategy of reframing the way they look at a situation. And one of our favorite examples came from a guy who was an engineer by training and went to work right after school, I think, with one of the largest steel companies in the country. And after a short period of time, probably in part because of his emotional intelligence, he moved into management. And he described a situation which occurred just after he had been promoted to his first job as a plant manager. Now that's really a very important and a very difficult job where you're in charge of an entire plant producing product. In this particular case, it was a very important plant because this was a plant that produced steel for one of the largest automobile companies in the country. So he had been in the job for only about a week or so and went to a meeting with his management team to a meeting with about 20 engineers from their primary customer, the auto company. So he walked in, this meeting occurred once a year, and he expected that he would, you know, hear some good things, some bad things, and take it away and try to do better next year. Well, he walked in the room, and almost immediately, the engineers tore into him and the company. they presented a very long litany of complaints. And basically the story was, the bottom line was, you guys are terrible at everything. You're at the very bottom of all our suppliers in terms of quality, in terms of on-time delivery, in terms of responding to problems, and on and on and on. But he managed to pull himself together. And at the end of this, presentation by the engineers, he calmly stood up and he said something really disarming. He said, if I were you, I would fire us. But if you give us the opportunity to fix these problems, I promise you, next year when we have this meeting, we're going to move from the bottom to one of the top suppliers. So I think that really convinced them to give him and his team another opportunity. He went on, by the way, to become the COO of the company, the second highest executive in the whole company. Anyway, after telling this story, we asked him, his name was Tom, that's the name that we gave him in the book. Tom, how did you feel when you were sitting there? I mean, totally unexpected. You've been in the job for only a week. And he said, that's exactly right. I'm in the job for less than a week, and all hell breaks loose. What is going on? And then I got really angry. I was looking at all my managers around the table, and I was thinking, where have you guys been? I mean, you're the ones who are to blame for all of this. And so we said, well, how did you manage these emotions and pull it together to make it come out the way it did? And that was one of those gems that we got from the study at that point. He sat back and he said, well, very early in life, I learned that reacting viscerally is really not a great idea. And that's what I was doing. So, I took a deep breath and I began to, think about the situation in a way that helped me to calm down. First of all, I reminded myself that the world is really complicated and messy. And, we always are dealing with problems and challenges. And, it should have been expected that, I would have to deal with this. And then he said, and as managers and as leaders, that's really a primary part of our job. I mean, often we think that it's just, kind of noise, a distraction getting in the way. But actually, that's what we're there to do, to identify and deal with these problems. And the higher we go in the company, the harder the problems are, because the easy problems get solved at lower levels. So this helped him to kind of normalize the situation. Oh, okay, so, this is what the job's all about. So let's, figure out what we can do here. And the other thing that he thought about as he was looking at his management team was that, the world is really complicated. And so it's really simplistic to blame any particular individual or group of individuals when things go wrong. I mean, it's always a very complicated mix of personality and team dynamics and the situation, and undoubtedly the company contributed to it in some way. So that helped me the next day when I sat down with the group, and my goal was to kind of get this very defensive, demoralized group back on track and working to start fixing these problems. That helped me to think, okay, I'm not here to blame them. I'm here to hear what they have to say, and then to help them to move forward. And that's what he did. He sat there for the next 30 minutes or so, just hearing these guys very defensively say, well, it wasn't our fault, we didn't get enough resources from the company, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of managers in that situation, a lot of leaders, would probably at some point really, get angry and recognize that they were being defensive. But Tom sat back, let them get it all out, and he said, okay, I understand things haven't been easy, but let's now focus on the future. What can we do as a team to focus on these things? And so these turned out to be reframing strategies that a lot of our leaders use in a lot of different situations. Seeing the world as complicated and messy, recognizing that part of their job was dealing with problems, and that they shouldn't be surprised that they spend a lot of time dealing with these problems. Not blaming the victim, not playing the blame game. And a couple of other things that Tom demonstrated in that situation. One thing that a lot of these leaders did was, rather than get angry or kind of jump in and come up with the first solution that they thought of, they would adopt what we think of as an attitude of inquiry. And that's what Tom did. As he got calmer, his goal became to really find out what it was that was making these engineers so upset. So yeah, we were really bad on on-time delivery. What was it about that? Give me some examples. How did that really affect your production? And by asking questions rather than responding defensively or trying to come up with solutions, he learned a lot that he could then take back and use to fix. And one other reframing technique that we saw a lot of leaders use was to focus on the task. Focus on what you're there for. Tom was there to find out what was causing these problems. And so once he was able to kind of manage his emotions and get focused on the task, that became his primary objective. And so he was so busy trying to hear what the engineers were saying about the problem that he wasn't bothered anymore about his management team or what the consequences might be. He wasn't sitting there catastrophizing, oh my God, what's going to happen to my career? He was just focusing on what had to be done at that moment. And again,
okay, well, let me stop you for a second, Cary. First of all, it's a great story. And second, I mean, when you stop and you think about what might other people have done different, I mean, part of this is like, first of all, catastrophizing is probably a pretty good choice. Like, how did I get here? Who was the recruiter that put me in this spot?
Yeah.
Should I get on the phone and talk to them right away about finding someplace else? Exactly. Is anybody on this team worth keeping? I mean, why are these the right people for this job? How could they possibly be this bad? I mean, all those thoughts, I think, would be more typical for most people in a brand new situation, and that's the first thing they hear. So the Tom, whoever he was brilliant at first in his response to the customer. I mean, that in itself was amazing, right? That just to automatically stand up and say, I can promise you in a year, because he's given his word, and he doesn't even know his team yet. And also his ability to be with his team and not be judgmental and not say, well, you people stop whining and let's start talking about, what it is. I'm not saying I'm blaming you, but I'm not letting you off the hook either. It just took a very direct, different approach. And then if you don't like this approach, then you need to leave, because I want people here who are going to turn this around. I mean, I've seen people who are turnaround managers come in with a very different attitude to a situation like this. And yet it's based on that story being successful. That's an amazing story, I think, about somebody who really embodies, if you will. And then you wonder, how did this person get to be like that? What gives somebody the self-confidence in a brand new meeting to stand up and say, we're going to turn this around in a year? Yeah. And then not be judgmental of the people that created this mess and all those things that you talked about. I think that's a great story. Is there some way others can duplicate that?
Well, really, that gets to what I think is the main takeaway of the book, and that is that Tom is probably what we might think of as an emotional genius, But in a lot of cases, you don't need to be an emotional genius. If you just have the strategies and you have them in front of you, I mean, anyone can just, write them down, put them on a little card and always have them in front of them. Look at read about the stories in the book, and then just practice. That, I think, is an important feature of the book, and that is, at the end of every chapter, there are activities that people can use to really start practicing and using these strategies. And maybe this is expecting too much, but I think most leaders, over time, as they use these strategies, can, have similarly positive outcomes in dealing with these sorts of situations.
Well, I think the takeaway for anybody listening to this who's a leader is that at some point you may be faced with this, and you've just read or heard about a situation where you now have something that, if you remember it, is a plan for when you face a consequence that is really surprising and upsetting. Yeah. And yet, instead of just reacting, which is it's the fear or flight syndrome in that case, right? Am I going to run or am I going to fight with this? And then instead, just thinking about, hey, I'm an engineer. This is a problem. We got to figure out how to solve it. That's what we do. And just having that kind of not matter of fact, but just sort of a way of thinking about things, that it's going to be messy. And this is messier than I thought, maybe, but so this is a real challenge to use all the skills that we're all bringing to the table. And so let's get to it. And just what a difference that makes.
And I think, if you don't mind, and part of the backstory also is that Tom did feel some fight or flight. I mean, he used some swear words when he was doing that interview, and he really didn't know what the answer was. And I think he was scared. Like, what did I just get myself into? But he knew that he could not, if he were to bring all that into with the group, that was going to regress it wasn't going to help them progress forward. It was actually going to make them go backwards. So anyway, he was human too. And but he knew that he had I think, which a lot of the leaders did, they knew how their emotions could potentially affect those that they worked with. So he was aware of that.
That's great. I think I'm going to want to just move again with the times. Yeah, time goes fast when you're having fun, and this is fun. So I want to make sure we get to the other chapters. We had two more we're going to talk about. So Cornelia, you want to talk about chapter 4?
So chapter 4, what is I think what's it like for others? So putting yourself in others' shoes. I remember one director of a social service agency. There was a very, very horrific case that happened, and it involved the death of a child. So she decided to go see why the caseworkers who had been assigned to this, what was preventing them from seeing what was going on. So she actually went to the house where this happened and could then understand the way that the house was situated. There was a basement, but it was hidden in such a way that the caseworkers would not have seen this extra room where this child was. So unfortunately, they missed some flags about the development of this problem. But after she had been there, she was much more able to speak on the caseworker's behalf, because she understood some of the things that got in the way of successfully sort of being there for this particular parent. Anyway, that was just one of several examples of the man, instead of blaming the employee, which often happens when something goes wrong, it's like, oh, what did you do? She actually took some time and went to investigate what it was all about. And that happened again with other leaders. And then you had other leaders who, in order to put themselves in other shoes, they did other things like they remembered their own experiences. I'm thinking of a principal of a school who remembered what it was like as a parent. So when she would go in for meetings, when there was an issue with a particular student, she knew, listen, my guess is these parents are going to be, anxious and, maybe a little defensive about their child having problems, because she knew as a parent that that's probably how she would feel. So she would often pull up her experience before having meetings with parents. And so they would, they would really go to their way to find out what it was really like, both physically to walk in their shoes, as in the case of the first person that I spoke about, or to think in their head, what might they be thinking and feeling at this time. So
you raise an interesting point. In our consortium, when we were Dan Goldman introduced the idea that there was more than just intellectual empathy, which is understanding why somebody feels some particular way, and also emotional empathy, which is feeling what somebody else feels. Dan said there's also empathic concern, which is caring about how somebody else feels. But empathic concern is more about whether you care about it and what you do about it. And, at some level I thought, well, that's not really a skill, but what I came to realize and understand is without empathic concern demonstrated by the two leaders that you just talked about, Cornelia, none of it matters. If you don't really care about how other people feel, the fact that you're skilled at it really doesn't matter. But in these cases, particularly in the first case, the child died, right? In that case, I think. And then, so very easy to blame the case. People want to find blame somehow, and so the caseworker didn't catch it. And for that supervisor to do what he or she did, it seems to me was really supporting this individual, having their back. And that's one of those critical things that shows up in the literature about, when people leave companies, it's because they don't feel their supervisor has their back, doesn't support them, doesn't really go that extra mile. So this was more, at least in my mind, it was an empathic concern really demonstrated that I'm going to go and walk in your shoes, which is a perfect example of walking in your shoes, going to the same house and seeing this. But I felt like in that case, my God, that employee must have been so thrilled that the supervisor found this out, because I'm sure she's blaming herself too, the person. So that was a great example of that, I found.
Not everybody sees things the way you see it. So when you walk in somebody else's shoes, you come to a new understanding, and that's a really important thing to know when you're working with people. Not everybody sees things the way you do. So
great. Thank you, Cornelia. I want to make sure we get to the last chapter we're going to talk about, chapter 7, Cary.
Okay, so the strategy I talked about before has to do with managing your feelings by changing the way you think about the situation. And a lot of leaders use that strategy. But there's another way to go about it, and that is, rather than trying to change your the way you think about the situation, change the situation. Change the situation. And one of the ways that the leaders did that was to modify the interpersonal boundaries to create a more optimal interpersonal boundary. Let me give you a very quick and simple example, but also one that shows how powerful this can be. One of the leaders we interviewed talked about, she was the president of the board of a social service agency in the community, and their program manager had gone away on maternity leave and had just come back and was really kind of overwhelmed with everything that was sort of falling in on her. And the office was set up so that she had a little office that was right next to a larger office where all the staff and clients were interacting and phones were ringing. And she just found it extremely stressful. So she and the staff and the president of the board sat down to try and figure out what they could do. And what they came up with was, the office has a door. Why doesn't the program manager just keep the door closed? And if someone wants to talk to her rather than interrupting her, use their cell phone to send a text message. So it was like magic. Overnight, she had almost unlimited time to herself in this quiet, small office. Everybody else felt like she was, you know, just a few taps on their phone away if they needed her. Now, you know, someone could have worked with the supervisor, the program director, for a long time to help her change the way she, you know, dealt with that situation internally. But it was so much easier and simpler to simply create a more rigid boundary between her and all the chaos that was going on in the office. So we have a lot of other examples like that in the book, but the basic idea is managing that boundary between you and other people in a way that really not only helps you to manage your emotions and to calm down when you're dealing with a difficult situation, but in many instances prevents stress and anger and all of those negative emotions from occurring to begin with. This, by the way, is not a new lesson. It's something that most parents of a toddler learn very early on. You know, you can keep sitting there all day, you know, hopefully not yelling at the kid to stop, you know, don't get so close to, you know, grandma's precious antique. But sometimes you can just get up and move it out of the kid's reach and save everybody a lot of.
I was wondering if you were going to have the parent texting the toddler, and I know you people are using this at a very young age, but yeah, so that's generational in some ways. But and a really nice example of how, you know, instead of a long-term drawn out, how are we going to fix this? It fixed it almost instantly. That's great. So sort of a reframing of the situation, not just a reframing of how you think about something, right?
That's great. I wish you had told us that before we wrote the book. We would have put it in there. I like the way you put it. Yeah, reframing the situation as opposed to reframing. I say as opposed, but actually, you know, many of the leaders use both strategies, sometimes in the same situation. But, you know, being the outstanding leaders they were at managing emotion, they would use, you know, one or the other, depending upon the situation.
Well, let me, well, first of all, thank you both very much, because we're basically reached the end here. What's the best way to order the book? And is there a place you'd like to send people to, or how can they get a copy of it?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can also go directly to the publisher, which is Oxford University Press. Bookstores we can't go to anymore in many cases, but when bookstores open up again, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, the book will probably be on display there as well.
Great. Any last thoughts that either one? Well, let me start with you, Cary, and then ask Cornelia as well. Cary, any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I think for me, the bottom line is, as I said before, that the main takeaway is that, you know, if you want to improve your emotional intelligence, that's fine. There are some really great programs out there. There are terrific coaches like Chuck who can help you to be more emotionally intelligent. But you probably already have a lot of emotional intelligence. And by using these strategies, you can really, and you can learn these strategies very quickly, you can begin to really leverage that emotional intelligence. And that's what we hoped for when we wrote the book.
Thanks, Cary. And Cornelia?
But this is actually the time when I think you can get the most practice out of them. So I actually think this is a great time to open up the book and try something, because it just will help. It won't hurt.
Thank you. You know, one of the things I read at the very end of the book, you wrote something along the lines that, you know, it's great to have these abilities, but it really all comes down to how you use these abilities, right? These actual practices by real leaders who are successful and effective leaders, I think was something that everybody at every level that's interested in leading in whatever domain, in whatever way, informal or otherwise, I think will benefit from. So thank you both for being on the program. Much appreciated, and much success with the book. Thank you.
Thank you.